And life is what I want to talk about this morning. And I want to kick off by turning to Mark 12. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there, or if you just want to read along on the screen, either way. Mark 12, beginning in verse 13. Then they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to trap him in his words. And if you know anything about those two groups, that was a trap. Those two groups disagree about almost everything when it comes to politics, and they completely disagree about the question they're going to ask Jesus here. When they came to him, they said, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and do not court anyone's favor, because you show no partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. So, here's the question, now that we've buttered you up. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" And given what you may know about those two groups, what can he possibly say that won't enrage one group or the other or both? But, the text says, he knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." So they brought the coin, and he said to them, "Whose image is this? Whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. Why are they utterly amazed at him? What has he said here that's so surprising? Many volumes have been written about this passage, and I think most of these volumes, quite understandably, look to this passage for clues about Jesus' position on politics, on taxation, on economics more broadly. And most of that's fine and good. My interest in this passage, however, lie elsewhere. I'm quite interested in the way that Jesus appeals to an image in this scene. In considering the question from the Pharisees and Herodians, Jesus asks for a coin so that he can look at it, asking, whose image is this? Whose inscription? There are some deeply significant things packed into this question. This is a denarius from the time of Tiberius, who was the Caesar referred to in that passage. So this is probably similar to the coin that Jesus was referring to. There's debate, but it's probably somewhat similar to this. This coin is an instrument of power, monetary power, fiscal power. And it bears an image. What's the purpose of an image on a coin? What function is this image serving? This image, I think, we could answer that question, designates an authority structure that upholds and rules over this monetary system. And it is loaded. It's a loaded claim to authority. If you can see the coin from where you're at, oh, it's much bigger there. The front has an abbreviated inscription that says, "Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus." And it has his profile image on the front. Caesar Augustus Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. And on the back, you see an enthroned figure. That figure is Pax, or peace. And it has an inscription that goes around it. This is Pontiff Maxim, which means high priest. That enthroned peace, we can tell it's peace. It holds an olive branch, and the spear is facing downward rather than upward. So it seems to be peace. And it seems that the high priest of that peace is the son of a god, Tiberius. So this inscription is not only political and monetary, but it's also deeply religious. It's an image of the son of a god. So Jesus concludes, "This coin bears Caesar's image, so render it to him. He is the master, even the god of it, of sorts. He's the god of this power structure and presents himself as such." But I think we misunderstand the point of this passage unless we keep reading all the way through. And I have some fears that simply reading this passage in terms of trying to discern what Jesus' politics are misses the point to a great extent. We read all the way through, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. We often read that last bit as being quaint and kind of hollow, I think. We don't read it very often. Doesn't everything belong to God? If so, then rendering to God what is God's somehow doesn't mean much if you're saying render to Caesar what's Caesar's, this coin. What else is the exception? Does Jesus have something more specific in mind here as needing to be rendered to God? Remember, Jesus' conclusion about the coin is based on an appeal to the authority of the image that it bears. So when he says, render to God what is God's, it seems as though he's speaking specifically about something that bears God's image. So what bears God's image? The human person, Genesis 1 tells us, is made in the image of God. So what Jesus is implying, what is Jesus implying that should be rendered to God here? I think it's you, all of you. It's no wonder that Jesus' questioners were amazed at him. He turned the whole thing around on them. Render to Caesar the items that bear his image, so long as you render your entire self to God, because his image, his inscription, is on you. And on Caesar, for that matter. Caesar's power structure suddenly becomes much shallower, doesn't it? I'm not so sure Jesus really answers the question, actually. He radically reframes the whole question. And it's worth noting that once you get this, you see why it makes sense that almost immediately following this episode, in both Mark and Matthew's account, we get Jesus' articulation of the greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all of yourself, and love your neighbors as yourself, because they too bear the image of God. In other words, render to God what is God's, and that means, and the means of rendering in God's economy is love, I think. The way we render images is love. That is God's economy. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. But I want to back up a bit and focus more intently on what it means when we speak about the image of God. I want to ask two questions to begin with. First, what does it mean to be an image? And second, what does it mean for that image to be of God? And then I want to ask a third. What does it mean for this image to malfunction? I'm getting in way over my head here, aren't I? Yeah, that's okay. Let's start with that first question. Precisely, what does it mean for something to be an image? This is an extremely complex question, but we'll keep it simple here, relatively simple. Generally speaking, we might say that an image visually refers to something else by bearing some kind of similarity or likeness to that something else. That means that an image is simultaneously a thing in itself, such as ink on paper, or in this case, patterns of light projected onto a screen. And it is also meaningfully something other than this thing in itself. As you look at this particular thing, you're immediately finding yourself thinking about Abraham Lincoln, which, of course, is something entirely different than what is actually here, a white screen hanging behind me from the ceiling with points of light projected onto it. In other words, an image is never self-contained. It's never a self-contained thing, but is always already held in relationship to, and is in fact endlessly deferring to, something other than itself. You look at this object and you see Abe. It has deferred, it's pointed you elsewhere. And likewise, we need to say that the meaning of an image is also not self-contained and fixed within itself. Its meaning is always contingent upon that something else to which it refers. The meaning of this image changes as our understanding of what it refers to changes. The more you know about Abe, the more you'll think about this image, perhaps in those terms. Here's another of my favorite examples. This image would have been mostly unintelligible to a 17th century person, or any other century person. And but we have lots of knowledge about these structures. and about this place. And so it means a great deal by virtue of what we have learned about what is being referred to in the image. This image certainly seems to mean something different to us today after 2001 than it did for the person who took this photo, certainly. Those two towers are laden with a massive amount of meaning. This image hasn't changed, but the meaning of the image has because our understanding of what it refers to has changed. There are a number of different ways that a referential function of an image might occur, and we'll talk through that a little bit. First, you're most familiar with representational images, those which mimic the visual appearance of something or someone or somewhere. In this case, it's paint that mimics how the head of the face of Rembrandt appeared. That's representational imagery. But there are other ways that images can work. This is what we'll call an indexical image. And don't get tied down by the vocabulary, but you can learn this if you want. This is an indexical image, which means it doesn't so much mimic what the thing looks like, but it is the imprint of the thing. It bears the trace of the thing. That's what we call an indexical image, a trace or an impression. Other examples of indexical images would be like footprints in the snow, or smoke is an indexical image of fire, and so on. They refer by way of being consequences rather than representing what the thing looks like. And some images are both representational and indexical, like death masks. This is the death mask of Coleridge, which means that it was cast from his face. So it both represents his appearance, but is the direct mark, the direct trace of his face. And in fact, photographs are, in general, indexical images in the fact that they are just receiving light that falls on a panel of pixels or film or something like that. And we could continue on with this. There are lots of other images. How do graphs and maps work as abstractions of information and so on? But I think these will do for now. Perhaps illumine something about how we understand the image of God. Perhaps we are made to be representations of him. Or we bear his impression, his fingerprints. We're lungs with his breath in them, and so on. But in an ancient context, images were much more than either representational or indexical. They mediated the presence of that to which they referred. The purpose of this image is not to show you what the Pharaoh Khafre looked like. The purpose of this image was to be indwelled by the spirit of the Pharaoh after he had left his body. And just so you get a detail there, this is the falcon god Horus wrapped around his head, kind of nurturing him, guiding him, presiding over him. I think it's significant that we do get winged creatures presiding over the throne of God in the Old Testament, but there's no head there. There's no form there. We have cherubim reaching over something that's uncontainable, or they're reaching over a promise, the instruments of the covenant, and so on. Or here's another example. This is a Canaanite golden calf. This does not show us what Baal looked like, but rather it provided a place for the god to become present to the people who worshipped it. Either the god indwells this calf, or there are theories that the god was supposed to sit on the calf. At any rate, the image isn't exactly representational, and it's not exactly indexical. It's supposed to mediate a presence, the presence of the thing it refers to. I think these are helpful entry points into talking about what an image is, but I want to move on to that second question. What does it mean for an image to be of God? We have some pointers here as to how ancient cultures may have thought about an image being of God. Genesis 1 provides us with the language of humanity being created in the image of God. And in order for us to really understand the gravity of this phrase, I think we have to flip back there and put Genesis 1 in context. Original context, the context of the passage that it appears in, and a little bit its ancient cultural context. This is not written for our context, I think, Genesis 1. It's not written to narrate a modern scientific chronological account of the world. Rather, it's narrating creation as, I want to say, the construction of a temple. It is depicting a working God. These are 6 metaphorical work days. A God at work constructing the cosmos as his palace temple. He opens up and marks out a world by way of forming spatial contrasts along 4 axes: light and dark, sky and earth, land and sea, and because he chooses to work over several days, time. The ancient world would have been entirely comprehensible as operating along these 4 basic axes. The entire space of life could be understood in terms of day and night, above and below, homeland and sea, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Genesis 1 is saying that all these realms of life are opened and formed by God. They do not emerge by themselves, and it's not a group effort. And as a whole, the space of the cosmos is most deeply understood to be a temple or a tabernacle of the one who most truly is and from whom all things are given. If the world's status as a temple isn't entirely clear from reading Genesis 1, then I think it becomes more clear as we see the way that other Old Testament authors are reading and interpreting that passage. So for instance, if you go to Job 38, Psalm 104, those are great examples of creation as temple. And just to give you a few specific examples, we read very often about the foundations of the earth, the pillars of the earth, or the pillars of heaven, the heavens. We read about the windows being in the heavens, God stretching out the heavens like a canopy or a tent, the storehouses of the earth, and so on and so forth. All that language kind of freaks us out because we're post-Copernicans. But if we're reading it as Copernicans and reading it for literal mechanical description of how the world is, then we're totally missing the point. The point of these passages is to give us the meaning of the earth, the meaning of the cosmos. And its meaning is that it is temple. It's the temple of the Creator God. It's a holy place. All of the earth, all of creation is sacred space and is set aside as sacred space. And I think Isaiah 66:1 lays it out extremely clearly, concisely. This is what the Lord says: heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where's the house you're going to build for me? How can you possibly? As a side note, I think the reasons we do build temples and sacred spaces is as a means of alerting ourselves, developing in ourselves sensitivities and attentiveness to the way that all of the earth is a temple. We make specific aesthetic places. We set aside them for practices and for thinking, for relating to each other in such a way that we believe all of the earth is God's temple, and every human person in it is the image of God. And what we do in those sacred spaces is supposed to spill out until we gradually realize that all of the earth is sacred space, and every human person is sacred space, sacred image. In the ancient Near East, these references and the whole idea of the cosmos as a temple wouldn't have been so surprising. They were familiar with this. What would have been extremely surprising and problematic is that it's not a pantheon, meaning it's not composed of many gods or many gods responsible for it. This is the Egyptian myth of creation and what the world is. It's composed of gods. That would have been surprising. The second thing that would have been surprising is that every ancient Near Eastern person would have understood that in the construction of a temple, the last thing that goes into the temple is the image of the god. The temple construction story in Genesis 1 follows this same pattern, but the image of the god that is set up in this temple is extremely surprising. We could talk a bit about how these temple structures work and how the image was supposed to work. It was formed in a holy workshop, and then they go through these processes of cleaning the mouth and cleaning the eyes and adorning the arms and freeing the arms and so on, so that the object is released from being a man-made thing and is able to be indwelled by the god. We get something somewhat similar in Genesis 1, only there aren't objects being made, there are people being made. The image that goes in God's temple is the human person, a living image, both individual and corporate. You, individuals, and as a body, are the image of God, biblically speaking. When we return to Genesis, we find this to be the case. You are the image of God. And more specifically, every person sitting next to you is the image of God. And every person you see on the television and that you drive by in your car and that you call a dork for the way that they drive is the image of God. I'm sorry, that is the word that slips out of my mouth most when I'm driving. Confessions, true confessions. It could be worse. You know. So what does this mean? If you are a holy image, you've been made to be the place where God's goodness and authority is supposed to be present in the world. And what does this mean? What are the implications of considering human persons to be at their most fundamental level images? Humans are imaging mechanisms, I want to say. In our lives, in our identities, we project and refer and defer to something outside of ourselves, always. And what is the mechanism by which we image? Make ourselves into images and project images onto others. We might suggest that it's our rationality. Rational imaging is a powerful means of imaging. Our worldviews, our beliefs, our capacity for language, those are all powerful imaging mechanisms. Our imaginations. Further than that, we must include the whole of our created selves, I think. We are images not just in our minds or in our hearts, but in our bodies. You as a whole thing are created to be in the image of God. You are not the image of God when your soul is sucked out of your body. You are the image of God when you are a human, I think is what I want to argue. And we'll just let that ride as the argument, without an argument. So further than that, we include our whole created selves, our actions, life practices, habits. Behaviors are certainly our means of image making. And certainly all of this must be included. The image of your life is the overall stance of your life, not just what's in your head or how you behave. I want to suggest, however, that our imaging is organized by something deeper. Our imaging mechanism is our love. We image what we love. There's no single greater force in the formation of the human person than love. Being loved and loving something, someone, something other. And love is always directed outwardly. It can be directed toward the self, but it's an inversion. It's an action that spirals back, so to speak. It's a curving in on oneself. There's no single greater force than love. In the formation of identity, we become like what we love. And once again, this should call our attention back to Jesus' articulation of the greatest commandments. What and how you love is at the center of the human person. human identity. G.K. Beale wrote a book called We Become What We Worship. It's a fascinating book. I recommend it. I learned a lot from it. It runs off the rails in the last chapter, but hey, this talk will probably run off the rails in the last chapter. So, his thesis is that people resemble what they revere, either for their ruin or their restoration. That's how he argues it. And I think all of this helps illumine the reason that idolatry is the extraordinary problem that preoccupies the rest of the Old Testament. In the context of Genesis 1, idolatry can be understood as the image of God imaging what is not God. Idolatry is the living image of God, loving and thus refashioning itself into something other than towards God. And in fact, often doing violence to the image of God in others as a result, desecrating the temple and desecrating his holy images. That's extremely problematic, to put it simply, obviously. Idolatry is the malfunctioning of the image of God. How do we understand this? What happens when an image malfunctions as an image? In what circumstances might we be unable to decipher what the image is of? And under what circumstances does an image fail? This might happen if the image has been damaged, defaced. There are many ways we might imagine an image failing because of mutation or damage. And I think all of us are defaced to some extent. Sometimes an image fails when it presumes to hold too much, to be too much. On the other hand, however, an image might fail when we viewers aren't familiar with what it refers to or how it's doing the referring. If I don't understand the language that's being used, or if I misrecognize the genre, I will misunderstand the image, and the image fails in one way or another. And I suspect that with regards to the image of God and other people, we struggle with both of these problems. We are each damaged, defaced in various ways, and we don't know how to deeply read the presence of God in these images of others anyway. We often simply don't know very deeply the one to whom these images refer to. And once again, it seems that the Bible identifies idolatry as sitting at the center of both problems. And more specifically, it identifies the problem of idolatry not merely as a problem of false imaging. After all, that doesn't sound so bad. False images can be quite interesting. The problem biblically is that the false image dies when it images falsely. The Bible says that we become like what we worship, which means that when we turn ourselves away from the source of life, then we gradually deaden. And we'll start to wrap things up here. I want to point you to Psalm 115 that I think argues this very directly. And it goes like this. And you'll find the same thing similar in Psalm 135, by the way. Psalm 115. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name be glory. You hear the language of referring, deferring elsewhere to the otherness of God. Not to us, but to you, because of your love and faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Why would they say that? Because there's no image. There's no object. There's no calf. There's no seated emperor. Where is their God? Our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases, meaning we don't have control over him. We can't control him in the same way that we can control the construction of an image, an object. But their idols are made of silver and gold, made by the hands of men. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell, hands but cannot touch, feet but cannot walk. They cannot even mutter in their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. The image here is that idolatry deadens the person, deadens our sensitivities, deadens our alertness to the fact that this is the temple of God and that each of the people around us is the image of God. Idolatry is deadening. Now, the psalmist uses can appeal to inanimate objects as idols who are dead and senseless to make the point, but I think we have to apply this to ourselves. What are the ways that we become deadened? What are the ways that we become the images of the things that we love that are not God? And that doesn't mean you shouldn't love creation and love other people. I think that is exactly what we should be doing. The issue is, what is our hope rooted in? What is our ultimate love rooted in? Where is the ultimate source of life for you? And if it's not in God, then obviously we've disconnected ourselves from imaging that which has life in it, and thus are going to deaden, become deader, become senseless, lose our senses. That's not a very high point to end on. We're out of time, but I'll give you a slightly, I was supposed to show some images there. I'll end on this point. I think it's interesting, we don't have time to go into it, but I think it's interesting that when we see Jesus showing up among people, the major part of his ministry is on the healing of bodies, I think, and the expulsion of demons, the demonic. And I think we can understand that as Jesus remaking the image of God, restoring the image of God in people, healing them, restoring their senses. There are loads of healings that happen, but the ones that are pulled out most often are the healing of the eyes, the healing of the ears. All of that is supposed to resonate against this deadness that the psalmist and that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel all point to as being the products of idolatry. Jesus heals the image of God in people. And I think, ultimately, we have to say that the image of any God is supposed to mediate the presence and the spirit of God. The spirit of life can inhabit that which Jesus has healed. Healed in terms of their senses, and healed in terms of the unclean spirits that are in them.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.